Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at the Rolex Sky-Dweller. So as with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and take a look at the history of the Sky-Dweller. The history of the Sky-Dweller is only, in fact, less than 8 years, so there's not much to it. I'm actually going to go go further back in time to before when it was released to understand why Rolex released this model. So we're going to go back in time to around the 80s maybe, and a little bit after that. Well, Rolex actually released a watch called the GMT Master back in the 50s. And it was designed for pilots that were passing through time zones constantly, obviously on flights, starting in one time zone and finishing in another. And the GMT Master meant that they didn't have to continually reset manually their watch. They were able to see two time zones simultaneously. So it was it was actually a very useful tool for pilots. But over the years, the general public loved that watch, the GMT Master, same way that they loved the Submariner. And the clients that were buying the GMT Master were actually businessmen and women that were flying from point A to point B and constantly traveling for work and needed to be able to quickly adjust a time zone on their watch. And also it was really useful for people that worked in an office, say in London, but constantly dealt with someone in New York. It was really useful for them to be able to see the time zone in New York as well as in London. Yes, of course, we live in an age that's got computers and clocks that can show two time zones and things like on our phone as well. So there's not necessarily a need for a watch like this, but people still love wearing watches. We see the time everywhere we go, even on our cooker or our microwave. We don't need to have a Swiss timepiece or Patek Philippe or Rolex, but people still love the romance of a watch, and that's why people still wanted to wear a timepiece, and also the one that really tells two time zones at the same time. So the GMT Master was incredibly popular with businessmen. But the thing that people often found with the GMT Master, though, was that it wasn't the most smart watch. It does look great and it's a great looking timepiece, but it's a sports watch at the end of the day. It's designed off the Submariner's case, so it's designed really as a dive watch case. So it's quite chunky, it's not very slender and slim and sparkly and delicate and classic looking, like the Datejust, say, for example. So Rolex really recognized that the fact, that the people that were wearing this now weren't pilots. It was actually just people that travel and really use the GMT Master function, but really wanted something a bit more smart, so that when they're wearing a suit in meetings, it doesn't look like they're just wearing a sports watch. So Rolex knew they had to marry kind of the Datejust look with the GMT Master function. So in 2012, at Basel 2012, they released a brand new model called the Sky-Dweller. Sky-Dweller named after obviously the fact that most people that buy this watch will be dwelling in the sky as their business travelers, flying often. That's where they got the inspiration for the name Sky-Dweller from. The Sky-Dweller was actually a very unique watch and a massive release from Rolex. It was the most complicated watch they'd ever created to that date. It was actually edging on Patek Philippe and Audemars Piguet levels of complication. It actually is an annual calendar, which is by far the most complicated Rolex in the collection. It featured a two time zone display on the dial as well, so you could see two time zones, which is fantastic for business travelers. But it featured the same sort of look as a Datejust with the fluted bezel. It did feature an oyster bracelet, but there were options to get this watch on a leather strap as well. So it was definitely aimed at a much smarter look. The fluted bezel obviously really adds that kind of twinkly, more special effect. Makes that watch look a bit more expensive, a bit more special. And also the watch was kind of only really available in precious metals or combinations with precious metals. You can't get this watch just in steel like you can the GMT Master. So it's definitely aimed at a much higher end audience, and someone who's looking for a much smarter watch. It was pretty appreciated when it was released in 2012. Obviously, being the most complicated Rolex, it gained a lot of publicity and popularity as a result of that. People really love the leather bracelet. That's been a very sort of leather strap version. That's been a popular watch for a long time. The full yellow, full rose versions have been very popular. It is kind of seen as one of the top end Rolexes that you can buy. There's not that many of them about, as in you don't see many of them about, which is kind of adds to the whole exclusive and high-end feel that this watch has. that kind of concludes the history of the Sky-Dweller and what it's about and why Rolex designed this watch. Let's take a look at some of the features and how to use this annual calendar Sky-Dweller from Rolex. So we're going to take a look at the clasp as always. The clasp on this watch is a simple oyster clasp, very, very good clasp. They're super easy to use. They don't tend to wear out over time. They're very slim, very classic. This one features the easy link adjustment, meaning that you can expand the bracelet by 5 millimeters. If in the summer when your wrist expands, the watch becomes too uncomfortable and too tight, you can then expand it out and it becomes much more comfortable. Same, that if you, in the winter when your wrist contracts a little bit, you can always take that size down by 5 millimeters as well. Every single one of our clients that owns a Rolex loves this feature and uses it all the time. The bracelet on this watch is the standard oyster bracelet from Rolex in the kind of most standard variant, which is the polished center links and brushed outer links. It's a lovely looking, super classic bracelet. It's kind of the essence of Rolex, this bracelet. Other options we can get for the Sky-Dweller, obviously this one is the steel bracelet, but you can also get it on a leather strap as well for the precious metal variations like the rose gold, the yellow gold, etc, etc. Moving now onto our case, we've got a pretty thick case. It's quite a deep case compared to something like a Datejust. Obviously has to house a bit more of a complex movement than the other watches in the collection, like a Datejust. And the way the movement works is actually very, very smart, which we'll come into in a minute. But it's a relatively deep case. It is in an all polished finish to match kind of the Datejust style, and again like an improvement on that GMT Master in terms of being much more dressy. Of course we've got our fluted bezel as well, which really adds to the smart look that this watch creates and what Rolex really was after when they were creating this watch. The actual case size of this watch is 42 millimeters, so it's a relatively large watch compared to lots of the other watches in the collection. It's obviously slightly larger than the 41mm Datejust, and it definitely wears larger than that. The 1mm does definitely make a difference. That additional depth makes it much larger, which I think is a kind of a questionable decision from Rolex, why they decided to make it so large. Whether or not it's because it had to be that large in order to house that movement, I don't know. But Patek Philippe manages to make, very complex perpetual calendars in like a 35, 36 millimeter case size. So it is obviously possible to create movements of incredible complexity in a smaller case. I'm just not sure why Rolex went for such a large watch. I assume really that those businessmen, I know from our clients that work in the city, would much prefer a smaller watch, especially if they're wearing it at meetings and didn't want to show it off too much. A smaller case size, if the Sky-Dweller was at 39 millimeters, say, I think it probably would have been, or maybe more popular now. Moving now onto our dial on this watch, we've got a really, really beautiful blue dial on this steel variation. This variation that we're looking at right now, the steel blue dial, is the most sought after Sky-Dweller in the whole collection. It has a long waiting list, sells for significantly over its retail price as well. Not many of the other ones are as popular. The precious metal ones are kind of popular, but not quite as much as the steel variants. But this is definitely the most popular of all of them, and it's not hard to see why. The blue dial is absolutely beautiful on this watch. It's like a sunburst effect on this watch as well. I love how balanced the dial is on this watch. With the different information, they've definitely tried to make sure it's super clear and easy to read. I like how everything is quite subtle in terms of different bits and bobs that they're trying to display. For example, your calendar, your annual calendar, is very subtly displayed above each of the index markers, and what month you're on is denoted by a little red flag on just above that index marker. Really, really nice subtle way to display the annual calendar there. Obviously our date is very simple and clear, as it is on all other Rolexes. They've chosen the bubble date, which is similar obviously to our Datejust. Would have been nice maybe to see this without the bubble, as maybe a more classic version of this watch. I think ideally if this watch was smaller, maybe at 40 millimeters or 39 millimeters without that bubble, it might look even smarter and more dressy, and maybe even an option with a Jubilee or presidential bracelet. Then looking at the other areas of the dial, we've obviously got our center part, our center ring, which is our 24-hour indicator, which can show either your home time or your current time. Usually this is set to your home time, so you can always refer back to that dial and know exactly what the time is in your home time zone. And then in the center of the dial, we obviously have our 3-hand seconds, hours and minutes. Let's take a look now at how to set this Sky-Dweller up. It's a pretty unique watch, and it uses actually some very smart ways to adjust the movement. Similar actually to the Yachtmaster 2 that we looked at a few weeks ago, in terms of using the bezel to communicate with the movement. So to start by setting this watch, we're going to unscrew the crown. You rotate the bezel anti-clockwise to the first stop. You'll feel when it stops at that point. This first position is to adjust just the date on the watch. It's a really fast, easy way to connect with just the date. Same way that on a date just you're able to do this. The great thing about the Sky-Dweller is you can move it forward and back rather than just moving it forward. So if you overshoot one of the days, you can quickly adjust it back again, which makes it super easy to adjust. Great for someone who's traveling a lot and maybe changing the date quite often. Nice and easy way to adjust it there. And this first position on the bezel for the date is actually the easiest way to adjust our annual calendar as well. So if you were to cycle through the days in the month, it will advance that little red flag around those index markers on the outside of the dial to show or indicate which month you're in. So this is the easiest way to adjust the annual calendar also. Now we'll rotate the bezel again to the next position, and this allows us to just adjust our local hours. So that just adjusts our hour hand in the center of the dial. Again, it leaves our home time in the center ring of the dial alone. It doesn't touch that at all. This is just to adjust your kind of new hand or your local time hour. So that's really, really nice that you can adjust that just on its own. And then rotating the bezel again to the next position, which is our final position, and that is to adjust everything at once. So that adjusts our 24-hour indicator in the center of the dial, adjusts our hour hand, our minute hand, and we're able to even adjust the date from here if we cycle through the hours, and even the annual calendar. Definitely a nice setup there in terms of how Rolex has designed this movement, and really cool that they've obviously used the bezel in order to communicate with the movement rather than using pushers on the side of the watch like Patek does and Audemars Piguet. This is actually a really smart way of doing it. And then obviously to set the watch back to be watertight again, we rotate the bezel all the way back round to its first position and then screw in the crown. Most of the time though, people will leave this bezel on that far left position or that far round clockwise position where it adjusts everything at once, rather than leaving it kind of rotated to the right hand side or the clockwise direction where you just change the date. It's not necessarily the most useful thing for you to be able to do. Now that concludes the features of the watch. What do I think of the Sky-Dweller? I think it is a fantastic looking watch. I wish it was smaller, like I said, more around 39, 40 millimeters. I think that would suit its purpose a bit more. Obviously being for businessmen who might want to be a bit more understated and wear this watch with a suit, a 42 millimeter quite deep, large, sparkly watch is not the most understated watch ever, especially if you're traveling. You actually kind of want something that's a bit smaller and a bit easier and harder to dink. Often planes are a real danger zone for dinking your watch, on the seat belts or the armrests. When you're loading your bag up into the overhead bins, you want a small watch that you can just tuck under your sleeve, whereas this definitely is not that. And the bezel is very prominent as well, obviously incredibly sparkly. So I think it's a great watch in concept, and I think it's amazing what Rolex has done in terms of having an annual calendar with that communicates with the movement through the bezel. I think it's super smart. I just wish it was smaller and a little bit smarter as well. But yeah, a great watch. It's not the most popular model with us. We find the day date and other models slightly more popular. The retail price of these watches is already quite expensive, but the premiums that some of them go for is very much over, which makes them very expensive models. So therefore we tend to have people looking elsewhere at other models instead, something like a day date, which is actually a bit more classic and a bit more elegant than such a large watch like this. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments what you think of the Sky-Dweller. Do you like the Sky-Dweller or the day dates or the date justs or GMT Masters? Do you like this model? If you do, let us know which dial variation you like of this watch, or even precious metal variation. And as always, if you're interested in this watch or any other watch in the Rolex collection, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description and also the end of the video. It'd be a pleasure to call this watch into stock for you. And in fact, we actually have this model available from us or with us now.